A true story by Red State Horror, The Silence at Blackwood Creek. Before we begin tonight's story, I want you to imagine something. Imagine driving through a small mountain town at dusk. One diner, one sheriff's office, one road in, one road out. Now imagine waking up the next morning and realizing no one remembers you were ever there. Not your coworkers, not your neighbors, not even the person who said they loved you. In some towns, people go missing. In others, they get replaced. Tonight's story comes from a place called Blackwood Creek. And this is what happens when the mountain finishes counting. Let's begin. Part 1. The weight of the air. Glad you could make it back to the porch. Pull up a chair and keep that coffee close. It's getting a bit colder tonight, isn't it? You know, people call these red states because of the politics or the maps, but I think it's because of the soil. It's stained with stories that the city folks would never believe. Stories about places where the law of man stops and the law of the mountain begins. Tonight, we're going into the heart of West Virginia to a town called Blackwood Creek. A place where silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's a warning. I'm glad you're here with me. Let's get into it. Elias Thorne didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in West Virginia. He believed in the way the mountains could swallow a man's scream before it even left his throat. He believed in the coal dust that lived in the lungs of every man over 40 in Blackwood Creek, a slow-moving silt that eventually turned your breath into a rattling chain. As the sheriff of a town that had been dying since the mines shuttered in '88, Elias was less a lawman and more a glorified hospice nurse for a zip code. His days were spent mediating disputes over rusted fence lines or telling the Miller boys to stop shooting their 12 gauges so close to the interstate. But that Tuesday in November was different. The air didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy. It was a barometric pressure that made the joints ache, and the dogs go quiet. Elias sat in his cruiser at the edge of the ridge, the engine idling with a rhythmic thrum that usually soothed him. He was looking down into the valley, where Blackwood Creek sat tucked away like a secret no one wanted to tell. The fog was thick, not the wispy romantic kind, but a gray curdled soup that seemed to rise from the earth itself. His radio crackled. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound like dry autumn leaves being ground into a mortar. Sarah? Elias picked up the mic, his thumb calloused and steady. Sarah, are you hitting the keyed mic again? I told you that spring is loose. No answer. Just the grinding static. Then, for a split second, a sound that made the hair on Elias's neck stand up. It was the sound of a child laughing. Not a happy laugh, but a rhythmic staccato sound, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Click. Silence. Elias frowned, rubbing his jaw. He looked at the dashboard clock, 4:14 p.m. The sun was already dropping behind the jagged spine of the mountains, casting shadows that stretched across the road like long, skeletal fingers. He put the cruiser in gear and began the slow descent into town. Blackwood Creek's main street was a collection of boarded-up storefronts and going-out-of-business signs that had been faded by 20 years of rain. The only light came from Mabel's Diner, a neon open sign buzzing with a dying frequency. When Elias stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed, but no one looked up. Mabel was behind the counter, her hands frozen in the middle of drying a coffee mug. Old man Henderson was in his usual booth, a fork halfway to his mouth. They weren't moving. They weren't even blinking. Mabel, Elias said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the vacuum of the diner. The air in the diner smelled of burnt grease and something else. Something metallic, like a penny held under the tongue. Elias walked over to Henderson and put a hand on his shoulder. The man's flannel shirt was ice cold. Clem? Elias shook him gently. Suddenly, Henderson's head snapped toward Elias. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated until the blue of his irises was just a thin, vibrating ring. It stopped counting, Elias, Henderson whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. Who stopped counting, Clem? What are you talking about? The mountain, Henderson said, his gaze shifting to the window, toward the dark wall of trees that loomed over the town. It got to 0. I didn't think it would ever get to 0. Then, as if a spell had been broken, Mabel started drying the mug again. Henderson took a bite of his pie. The normal sounds of the diner, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant clatter of the kitchen, rushed back in like a flood. Hey, Sheriff, Mabel said, her voice bright and hollow. Coffee? You look like you've seen a ghost. Elias backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. I know. I'm fine, Mabel. Did the radio go out a minute ago? I heard some interference. Mabel tilted her head, a strange, bird-like gesture. Radio? No, honey. It's been quiet as a grave in here all afternoon. Just the way we like it. Elias didn't stay for the coffee. He walked back out to his cruiser, his hand hovering over the grip of his sidearm. The fog had moved. It was no longer a blanket. It was a wall. It had surrounded the diner, cutting off the view of the station across the street. He got into the car and reached for the radio, but before he could touch it, the speaker erupted. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't the child's laugh. It was his own voice. The last thing Dale Mercer said over his radio, the last thing anyone ever heard from him, was 4 words. Elias froze. That was his voice, but he had never said those words. Not in that order. Not with that cold, dead inflection. The radio continued, the voice distorted by a layer of static that sounded like wet dirt being shoveled onto a coffin. It's already inside here. Elias ripped the wires out of the back of the radio. The voice stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. In the silence, he realized the engine of his cruiser had cut out. The lights on the dash were dark. He was sitting in a dead car, in a dead town, and for the first time in 55 years, Elias Thorne was afraid of the dark. He looked out the driver's side window. A figure was standing at the edge of the fog. It was wearing a park ranger's uniform. The hat was pulled low, shadowing the face. But Elias could see the boots. The figure was only wearing one boot. The right one. It was tied in a perfect double knot. The left foot was bare, the skin a pale, bruised purple. It didn't seem to touch the pavement. Elias reached for the doorknob, but his hand stopped. From the woods, from the deep, lightless throat of the mountain, came a sound. 99, 98, 97. It was a woman's voice this time. It sounded like his mother. His mother had been dead for 12 years. He looked back at the figure in the ranger uniform. It hadn't moved, but it was closer now. It hadn't walked. It had simply adjusted its position in reality. It was 10 feet away. Elias grabbed his heavy maglite from the passenger seat and clicked it on. The beam was weak, struggling to pierce the gray soup of the fog. He swung the light toward the figure. The ranger was gone. In its place, sitting on the hood of his cruiser, was a thermos. A battered, green Stanley thermos. Elias stared at it. He could see the steam rising from the cap. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the metal. It was scalding hot. And then, the radio, the one Elias had just ripped the wires out of, keyed itself. Elias, a voice whispered. It was Sarah, his dispatcher. She sounded like she was crying. Elias, I'm looking at the monitors in the station. I'm looking at the street feed. Elias grabbed the handheld unit. Sarah, I'm right outside the diner. My car is dead. What do you see? There was a long pause. The only sound was Sarah's ragged breathing. Elias, the cruiser is empty. I'm looking at the car right now. The door is wide open, and the engine is running, but you aren't in it. There's no one in the street, Elias. Where are you? Elias looked at his hands. He looked at the steering wheel. He felt the cold vinyl of the seat beneath him. I'm right here, Sarah. I'm in the car. Elias, she sobbed. Something just sat down in the driver's seat. It just appeared. It's looking right at the camera. Elias felt a sudden sharp draft of cold air. He turned his head toward the passenger seat. The seat was empty, but the leather was depressing slowly, as if someone, or something, were shifting their weight. And then, the counting started again, right next to his ear. 3, 2, 1. Elias Thorne didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in West Virginia. He believed in the way the mountains could swallow a man's scream before it even left his throat. Henderson's head snapped toward Elias. His eyes were wide. It stopped counting, Elias, he whispered. It got to 0. We're just getting into the deep water now. If you're enjoying the atmosphere of Blackwood Creek, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the Red State Horror family. It tells the algorithm that there are people like us out there, people who aren't afraid to look into the dark. And I want to hear from you. What's the smallest, creepiest town you've ever driven through? Tell me the name and the state in the comments. I read every single one of them, and yours might just be the setting for our next trip. Now, let's get back to Sheriff Thorne. He's about to find out that some debts are paid in bone. Part 2. The Geography of Shadows. The silence that followed the word 1 wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a vacuum that sucked the air right out of Elias's lungs. The interior of the cruiser felt like it had been plunged into a deep-sea trench. Every light on the dashboard, every flicker of the neon sign from Mabel's, every star in the sky, it all went out at once. Elias sat frozen, his hand still gripping the cold plastic of the maglite. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He waited for a hand to wrap around his throat, or for the distorted face of the ranger to appear in the window. But nothing happened. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to a darkness that felt thick, like velvet. He realized he wasn't in the car anymore. Or rather, he was in the idea of the car. He reached out to touch the passenger seat where the leather had been depressing, but his hand met nothing but cold, damp air. He fumbled for the doorknob, his fingers slipping on a surface that felt like rusted iron. When the door finally creaked open, it didn't make the sound of a modern hinge. It sounded like a gate in a graveyard, a long, agonizing groan of metal on metal. Elias stepped out onto the pavement. At least, he thought it was pavement. Under his boots, the ground felt soft, like mulch. But when he looked down, he saw the cracked asphalt of Main Street. "Sarah?" he whispered. The name didn't travel. It fell flat at his feet, as if the atmosphere refused to carry his voice. He looked toward the sheriff's station. It was still there, but it was wrong. The brickwork was overgrown with a gray, pulsating vine that looked like human veins. The windows were opaque, covered in a layer of grime that seemed to be moving on the other side of the glass. He looked back toward Mabel's diner. The neon open sign was still there, but it didn't say open. The letters had shifted, buzzing with a sick violet light. OVER. Elias felt a cold sweat prickle his hairline. He began to walk toward the station, his mag light cutting a pathetic, yellow swath through the gloom. Every step felt like he was pushing through waist-high water. That was when he heard it, not a voice this time. A shovel, scritch. Thud, scritch. Thud. The sound was coming from the middle of the street, just past the intersection. Elias angled his light. A man was digging a hole in the middle of the asphalt. He was dressed in the heavy canvas overalls of a coal miner, his face smeared with a soot so black it looked like charcoal. He wasn't using a pickaxe. He was pushing a rusted shovel directly into the hard road as if it were soft garden soil. "Hey!" Elias shouted, his hand dropping to the holster at his hip. "Stop right there." The miner didn't stop. He didn't even look up. Scritch. Thud. "I said stop." Elias drew his sidearm, the weight of the Glock, a small comfort in a world that had gone sideways. The miner paused. He leaned on the handle of the shovel and slowly turned his head. He had no eyes, where the sockets should have been. There were only smooth patches of pale skin, stretched tight over the bone. But he looked at Elias all the same. "You're late, Sheriff," the man said. His voice sounded like two stones rubbing together. "The shift started 20 years ago. You've got a lot of dirt to move. Who are you? Where is everyone? Where's Sarah?" The miner pointed a grimy finger toward the mountain, toward the gaping, black maw of the Blackwood deep mine. "They're in the place that teaches, learning their lessons. Same as you." The man turned back to his work. With one violent shove, he pushed the shovel into the ground and pulled up a clump of earth. But it wasn't earth. He pulled up a handful of human hair, tangled with bone and bits of rotted flannel. Elias didn't wait to see more. He turned and ran. He ran toward the station, his heart a frantic bird trapped in his chest. He burst through the front door, the bell chiming a low funereal note. Stories like this don't just come from the imagination. They come from the dark corners of the maps we forget to look at. If you're feeling the chill of Blackwood Creek, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to Red State Horror. It's the only way to make sure you find your way out of the woods next week. And if you've ever seen a town that felt wrong the moment you drove in, tell me the name of it in the comments. I'm looking for the next location, and I might just find it in your town. The station was empty, but it wasn't quiet. The walls were breathing. It was a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of the drywall, accompanied by a sound like a distant heartbeat. Elias ducked behind his desk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed the desk phone. It was a heavy rotary model from the 50s that hadn't been in the office in decades. He picked up the receiver. 987. He slammed the phone back down. "Think, Elias. Think," he hissed to himself. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He was looking for his emergency kit, but what he found made him stop. It was a file, a manila folder, yellowed with age and stained with something dark and sticky. Across the tab, in his own handwriting, were the words, "Mercer, Dale, Supplemental." Elias opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of the Cutter Ridge trailhead in Harlan County. But there was something in the background that hadn't been in the official police evidence. Standing in the tree line was a group of people. There must have been 20 of them. They were all wearing the same gray coal miner overalls. They were all staring at the camera, and in the very front holding a green Stanley thermos was Dale Mercer. Except it wasn't Dale. Not really. The man in the photo had Dale's face, but his skin was the color of a bruised plum, and his eyes were wide, vacant circles of white. Underneath the photo was a handwritten note. The mountain doesn't take what it doesn't need. It needs voices. It needs names. It needs a sheriff to keep the peace in the dark. Suddenly, the monitors on the wall, the modern flat screens that Sarah used for dispatch, flickered to life. Elias saw himself. He was looking at the feed from the street. He saw his cruiser, sitting empty in front of the diner. The door was wide open. Then, he saw a figure walk into the frame. It was Sarah. She looked exactly as she had that morning. Blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing her tan dispatcher's vest. She looked terrified. She was holding a flashlight, moving toward the empty cruiser. Sarah. "Get away from there." Elias screamed at the screen. On the monitor, Sarah stopped. She looked around, confused. She couldn't hear him. Elias watched as Sarah reached the driver's side door. She leaned in, looking for him. And then, a hand reached out from the darkness of the back seat. It was a pale hand. A hand with coal-stained fingernails. It grabbed Sarah by the throat and yanked her into the car. She didn't even have time to scream. The cruiser's door slammed shut. The engine roared to life. The tires screeched as the car pulled away, heading straight for the mountain road, straight for the Blackwood deep mine. Elias stood up, his chair clattering to the floor. He didn't care about the shadows anymore. He didn't care about the miner in the street or the breathing walls. He ran out the door, back into the freezing gray fog. The miner was gone. The hole in the street was gone. But sitting on the curb, right where his cruiser had been, was a single boot. A woman's hiking boot. Sarah's boot. It was tied in a perfect double knot. From the top of the ridge, a sound echoed down through the valley. It was the sound of a heavy iron door being dragged shut. Clang. And then, the counting started again. Not from a radio. Not from a phone. It was coming from the ground beneath his feet. 54, 53, 52. Elias looked toward the mountain. The fog was parting, revealing the entrance to the mine. It looked like a mouth that had been waiting a long time to swallow the law. He began to walk. Part 3. The Throat of the Mountain. Elias Thorne, the new sheriff of the place that teaches, closed his stone eyes and continued the work. 6, he whispered. The mountain was satisfied. For now, the entrance to Blackwood Deep didn't look like a mine anymore. It looked like a wound that had refused to heal, a jagged tear in the side of the mountain held open by rotting timbers and rusted iron bolts. As Elias approached, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The air here didn't just smell like coal. It smelled of old, stagnant water and the sharp metallic tang of dried blood. He stood at the threshold, his maglite beam trembling in the dark. Above the entrance, a wooden sign hung by a single rusted chain. The letters were almost gone, but Elias knew what they used to say: safety first. Now someone had carved a new message into the wood with a jagged blade: give until it takes. Elias stepped inside. The transition from the outside world to the mine was instantaneous. The sounds of the wind and the distant Cumberland River vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute it made his ears ring. Then, the dripping started. Drip, drip, drip. It wasn't water. It was too thick, the sound too heavy. Elias walked deeper, his boots crunching on something that sounded like dry glass. When he lowered his light, he realized the floor of the tunnel wasn't stone. It was covered in thousands of small, white objects. Teeth, human teeth, scattered like gravel, polished to a dull shine by years of unseen footsteps. "Sarah?" he called out. His voice didn't echo. The tunnel seemed to swallow the sound, digesting it before it could bounce back. He followed the tire tracks of his own cruiser. They were pressed deep into the layer of teeth, leading straight into the main artery of the mine, a section that had been condemned since 1974 after a collapse that had buried 14 men alive. As he walked, the walls began to change. The jagged rock smoothed out, turning into something that looked like petrified wood, or perhaps bone. And there were faces, not carved, but pressed into the walls, as if the mountain had taken a mold of everyone who had ever died in Blackwood Creek. He saw Old Man Miller. He saw the baker's daughter who had gone missing in '92. He saw his own father, his eyes closed, his mouth open in a silent, coal-dusted prayer. 41, 40, 39. The counting was louder now. It was vibrating through the soles of his boots. He rounded a corner, and the tunnel opened into a massive cavern, the central chamber. In the middle of the cavern sat his cruiser. The headlights were on, two blinding white eyes cutting through the darkness. The engine was silent, but the car was vibrating, humming with a low-frequency energy that made Elias's teeth ache. Sarah was standing in front of the car. She was facing away from him, her head bowed. She was still wearing her dispatcher's vest, but it was tattered, the tan fabric stained with a dark, oily sludge. "Sarah, it's me. It's Elias. I'm here." He ran toward her, his heavy boots kicking up clouds of white tooth dust. He reached out to grab her shoulder, but he stopped 6 inches away. Sarah was counting, but her mouth wasn't moving. The sound was coming from inside her chest, a muffled, mechanical drone that sounded like a recording played through a layer of meat. 32, 31, 30. "Sarah, look at me," Elias pleaded. Slowly, she turned around. Elias felt his stomach drop into a cold, dark place. Sarah's face was gone. In its place was a smooth, featureless mask of gray slate. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just the cold, hard texture of the mountain. She reached up with a hand that was now made of jagged coal and touched Elias's cheek. Her touch was freezing, a cold that went past the skin and bit directly into the bone. "You're finally here, Sheriff," she said. The voice didn't come from her. It came from the radio on Elias's belt. "The mountain was worried you'd lost the trail." Elias backed away, his hand fumbling for his gun, but his holster was empty. He looked down. His gun, his badge, even his wedding ring, they were gone. "What do you want?" Elias choked out. The Sarah entity pointed toward the back of the cruiser. The trunk was open. Elias walked toward it, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He looked inside. The trunk wasn't full of equipment or spare tires. It was full of boots, hundreds of them. Left boots, right boots, hiking boots, work boots, sneakers, children's sandals, thousands of them, all tied in perfect, identical double knots. And at the very top of the pile sat a green Stanley thermos. "The lesson is simple, Elias," the radio voice whispered. "Everything in this world is a trade, a life for a life, a name for a name. The mountain gave this town wealth for 100 years. It gave your father a job. It gave you a home. Now, the debt is due." "Take me then," Elias said, his voice cracking. "Take me and let her go. Let the town go." The slate-faced Sarah tilted her head. "The mountain doesn't want you dead, Elias. Dead men are quiet. The mountain wants you to be the sheriff. It wants you to stay here, in the dark, and keep the count." "The count?" "Everything must be counted. Every breath, every heartbeat, every secret. If the counting stops, the mountain wakes up. And if the mountain wakes up, West Virginia disappears." Sarah, or the thing that used to be her, reached into the trunk and pulled out a pair of heavy black leather boots. They were Elias's boots. His favorites, the ones he had been wearing when he entered the mine. He looked down at his feet. He was barefoot. He hadn't even noticed. His feet were white, the skin translucent, the veins beneath the surface glowing with a faint, bioluminescent gray. "Put them on, Sheriff," the voice commanded. "It's time for your shift." Elias looked at the boots. He looked at the slate-faced girl. He looked at the faces of his ancestors in the walls. He realized then that he hadn't come here to rescue Sarah. He had been summoned here to replace the man who had come before him. Dale Mercer hadn't been a victim. He had been the previous sheriff of the dark, and he had finally finished his count. Elias took the boots. He sat on the bumper of the cruiser and pulled them on. He tied the laces. Left. Right. Double knot. As he pulled the second knot tight, the cavern exploded with sound. It was a scream. Not of a person, but of the earth itself. The mountain was shifting, the stone grinding together like a giant's teeth. Elias felt his face go numb. He reached up and felt his skin hardening, his eyes clouding over with a layer of gray silt. He could still see, but he wasn't seeing light anymore. He was gaining weight. He was seeing the pressure of the rock above him. He looked at Sarah. She was changing too. The slate was peeling off her face, revealing her human features once more. She blinked, her eyes clearing, the terror returning to her face. "Elias?" she whispered. He tried to answer her, but his mouth wouldn't open. It was sealed shut by a layer of stone. "The count, Elias," the mountain whispered into his mind. "Start the count." Elias looked at Sarah. He saw the way she was shaking. He saw the way she looked at him, at the monster he was becoming. He did the only thing a sheriff could do. He protected her. He pointed toward the tunnel entrance. He couldn't speak, but he sent a pulse of will through the tooth-covered floor, a vibration that told her to run. Sarah didn't look back. She scrambled out of the cavern, her bare feet bleeding on the teeth, her screams echoing up toward the surface. Elias watched her go. He watched the light of her flashlight disappear around the bend. He was alone now. He sat in the driver's seat of the cruiser. He picked up the radio mic. He didn't need wires. He didn't need a signal. He was the signal. He looked at the dashboard clock. 11:59 p.m. He took a breath. A deep, heavy breath of coal dust and ancient air. 10, Elias Thorne whispered. His voice was a grinding of tectonic plates. 9. Outside, in the town of Blackwood Creek, Mabel stopped drying her mug. Old Man Henderson looked at the mountain. The fog began to roll in, thick and gray and hungry. 8. In a farmhouse in Harlan County, a woman named Carol turned on her radio. She heard the static, and then she heard a voice she almost recognized. 7. Elias Thorne, the new sheriff of the place that teaches, closed his stone eyes and continued the work. 6. The mountain was satisfied for now. Elias Thorne stayed in the dark so that Sarah could run back into the light. We tell these stories every week not just to get a chill or a thrill, but to remember something important. Life can feel like that mountain sometimes. It can feel heavy, it can feel like it's closing in, and it can feel like the count is against you. We all have our Blackwood Creeks, those moments where we feel isolated and overwhelmed by the shadows. But remember this, even in the deepest mine, even in the darkest hollow of West Virginia, there is a reason to keep walking. Elias chose to stand his ground. He chose to be the barrier between his people and the dark. You have that same strength in you. No matter how loud the silence gets, or how heavy the weight of the world feels tonight, don't let it claim you. Keep your light burning. Keep your head up, because as long as we're sharing these stories, none of us are truly walking through the woods alone. Thanks for sitting with me tonight. Sleep well, if you can. Some towns survive because people protect them. Some towns survive because people forget. But here's the thing about fear. It doesn't exist to destroy you. It exists to sharpen you, to remind you to pay attention, to trust that feeling in your chest when something isn't right. If a place ever tells you not to go deeper, listen. If your instincts ever whisper that something is off, respect it. Because the world is wide, and beautiful, and strange. And sometimes, the difference between a story you tell and a story told about you is whether you choose to turn back. Thank you for being here in the dark with me. I am Rylan. If you enjoy stories from America's forgotten roads and small towns, subscribe for more. And until next time, thanks for sitting with me. Sleep well, if you can. I'll see you next week, right here, in the dark. Stay aware, stay curious, and I'll see you in the dark.